The Christ is King controversy plays a significant role in the Great Meme Wars, which have already begun. The Great Meme Wars are, of course, the battle of ideas raging on in the West, and as the Brigadier General of the enlightened centrist movement, I intend on fighting in these wars on behalf of the silent majority, the politically homeless, and the reasonable center. We should think about the Christ is King controversy in the same way we think about the OK sign controversy. With the OK sign controversy, a bunch of basement-dwelling 4chaners got mainstream society to believe that the OK sign, the most innocuous, basic hand gesture to mean okay, was actually a symbol for white supremacy.
The Anti-Defamation League officially included it in its Hate on Display database in 2019.
A similar thing is happening now with the phrase Christ is King, which is a common Christian phrase to denote the divinity of Jesus Christ, is being hijacked by what is known as the freak right. The freak right is made up in part by a bunch of autistic Zoomer Nazis who have problems with Jewish people as opposed to having problems with the Jewish religion, which is of course a very reasonable thing to have problems with, just as it's reasonable to have problems with the Christian religion or the Muslim religion, or any religion for that matter. There's a number of people who believe that the proper response to this attempted memetic parasitizing of the phrase Christ is King is to avoid using it.
But it's become increasingly clear that Trumpism and that Trump ethic is really leaking into American Christianity itself. As we saw during Holy Week, Christians all over Twitter were posting Christ is King, specifically aimed at Jewish Americans, specifically aimed to assert religious dominance in a very gross and ugly way. And we're seeing this just leak out, Mika, and it is very distressing. But even more than that, it is very dangerous.
I regard this as utter cowardice, and I refuse to cede the linguistic and memetic territory to a bunch of autistic Zoomer Nazis. I am absolutely going to start saying Christ is King, probably just all the time now, because I do not want the only people saying that very reasonable phrase to be the freak right. As an enlightened centrist, I'm very sympathetic to Christianity. I would call myself a cultural Christian in the same way that hardcore atheists like Richard Dawkins would say.
I do think that we are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer. But there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian.
I believe the phrase Christ is King is a meme worth preserving. But more importantly, it is important to recognize the memetic significance of this phrase in catalyzing a civil meme war on the right. I, for a long time, predicted incorrectly that Jordan Peterson would be the one to catalyze the civil meme war on the right by bringing a more anti-religious dogma perspective to the conservative meme sphere. To me, it's quite clear that consistently educating and articulating why all of the most dogmatic elements of religion, and the Bible in particular, are not necessarily valid is probably a good thing for a largely religious audience to be exposed to. And I think Peterson, when he's on the Daily Wire and he's talking about evolution and all this different stuff, I think he's creating, we talked about this last time, I like sowing division on the far right and far left. I think he's going to sow strong division amongst the hardcore fundamentalists and the more, cultural Christians or whatever, which is what I would fall into. And I think that's a very good thing. Now, it turns out I was wrong, probably because I overestimated Peterson's level of disagreeableness and willingness to call out his own side for extremism. I think one too many dinners with Netanyahu may have complicated things as well. What I was not wrong about is that there would be a civil meme war on the right. And instead of Jordan Peterson catalyzing this civil meme war, it's been Candace Owens. And the two sides in this split on the conservative side is something like the pro-Zionist right versus the anti-Zionist right, or as I like to say, the Israel first crowd versus the America first crowd. I, as an American, am obviously more sympathetic to the America first crowd. I agree with a lot of the criticism of Israel coming out of progressive circles because, as an enlightened centrist, I recognize the many valid perspectives provided to us by the left. It's the freak left, like the ones from BLM Chicago who celebrated the paragliders who flew into the music festival, who should be utterly mocked and marginalized the same way that we would utterly mock and marginalize the freak right. But I am willing to admit the degree to which I underestimated how much people like Ben Shapiro or the evangelical Christian Zionists put the interest of Israel above that of the United States. For example, I disagree with the words he uses, but I empathize with the feelings of Tucker Carlson when describing Ben Shapiro.
I've got 4 draft-age children. So if you're playing recklessly, fast and loose with their lives, then I have a right to despise you, and I do. So if you're Nikki Haley, who's running for president, or Ben Shapiro, or half the people I see on television casually mentioning the possibility of nuclear war or sending Americans to fight in the Middle East, or in any way involving us in a war that has nothing to do with prosperity and peace at home, nothing, in other words, to do with us, Americans, then I have a right to call you out and be really offended because it's my family. They live here. It's not a joke to me. There's nothing abstract about it.
The most important thing that those of us who sympathize with the America First perspective can do is to purge ourselves of any members of the freak right, or the freak left for that matter. Anyone who is mentally or socially handicapped enough to purposely ignore the difference between Jewish people as a race and Judaism as a religion should be mocked as an autistic Zoomer Nazi, or maybe something less controversial. I just think that's a funny way to do it. The freak right and freak left get in the way of the very reasonable and moral critiques made of Israel, and the degree to which it is operating in direct opposition to American interests, let alone the millions of secular Israelis who hate the current Israeli government. So, on behalf of the 420th Special Memes Division of the Enlightened Centrist Army Group, I say to you, Christ is King. Good luck, and Godspeed.